There was a time when you could drive through rural South Dakota or pull off the highway near the Grand Canyon and walk straight into Bedrock, the cartoon town, the fake prehistoric suburb, fully built in concrete and paint by a family who decided that America needed this. It worked for decades, then it didn't. This is the rise and fall of Flintstones theme parks, Bedrock City, the show that started it all. Before there was a park, there was the show, and the show was genuinely unlike anything that had existed before it on American television. The Flintstones premiered on ABC on September 30th, 1960, produced by William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, the same duo behind Tom and Jerry, who had won 7 Academy Awards for that work and then pivoted into television with the kind of momentum that tends to make networks say yes to just about anything. The concept was deceptively simple. Take a contemporary domestic sitcom and set it in the Stone Age. Fred and Wilma Flintstone, their neighbors Barney and Betty Rubble, a pet dinosaur named Dino, a saber-toothed cat called Baby Puss, and eventually a baby named Pebbles, all living in the suburban town of Bedrock, where cars ran on foot power. Dinosaurs served as household appliances, and every piece of technology from the modern world had been reimagined in prehistoric terms. The show was openly, comfortably borrowed from The Honeymooners, Jackie Gleason's series about a blustering, big-talking bus driver and his long-suffering wife. And Gleason apparently considered suing before deciding he didn't want to be known as the man who yanked Fred Flintstone off the air. What made the Flintstones significant beyond its entertainment value was its scheduling. It was the first animated series to air in primetime, which had never been done before. Hanna and Barbera pitched it deliberately as an adult sitcom with animated format, and ABC accepted the bet. The night after it premiered, Variety magazine called it a pen and ink disaster. Variety was wrong. The show ran for 6 seasons and 166 episodes, held the record for longest-running animated series until The Simpsons finally overtook it in 1997 and entered continuous syndication almost immediately after its original run ended in April 1966. More than 300 million people in 80 countries eventually watched it in dozens of languages. Fred Flintstone became one of the most recognizable animated characters in the world, and the fictional town of Bedrock became a piece of shared pop cultural geography that a lot of people felt, on some level, they already knew. The show's specific genius for merchandising and licensing followed naturally from all of that. By the mid-1960s, Flintstones branded products covered everything from breakfast cereal to vitamins. The Flintstones chewable vitamins launched in 1968 and became one of the most successful children's vitamin products in American history, which tells you something about how deeply the brand had embedded itself into daily family life. Where there's that level of cultural saturation, someone is always going to start thinking about physical spaces, a cartoon that millions of families watched every week, that their children could identify on sight, that depicted a specific fictional town with specific recognizable buildings. That's not just entertainment, that's a destination waiting to happen. That familiarity is important. It's what made someone look at a stretch of South Dakota land and think people would pay to walk around in this. The Speckles family and the Black Hills. The person who had that thought was Woody Speckles, and he wasn't a theme park developer or an entertainment executive. He was an entrepreneur who recognized that the Flintstones had created something unusual, an immersive fictional world with such specific, recognizable architecture and domestic detail that it could theoretically be recreated in physical space. The show's version of Bedrock had houses made of rock slabs, a city hall, a barber shop, a grocery store, a police station, a movie theater, a water buffalo lodge where Fred went to meetings. It was a complete town, complete enough to build. Speckles and his son Francis purchased 62 acres in the Black Hills of South Dakota near Custer and negotiated a license with Hanna-Barbera to use the Flintstones characters. Bedrock City, South Dakota, opened in 1966, the same year the original television series ended its first run on ABC, which in retrospect was either impeccably timed or slightly unfortunate depending on how you look at it. Families who had spent 6 years watching Fred and Wilma every week could now drive up to Mount Rushmore country and actually walk into a version of the show. What they found was genuinely impressive for a family-built roadside attraction. The park's entrance featured a 20-foot tall statue of Dino overlooking arriving visitors, which must have been a fairly dramatic sight coming over a hill in 1966. The drive-in restaurant served Bronto burgers. Inside the park, a miniature train ran guests through Dinosaur Canyon, past a volcano called Mount St. Wilma, and around the property before returning to the depot. The town of Bedrock itself included reproductions of the specific buildings from the show: the Flintstones house, the Rubbles house, Mr. Slate's house, and more institutional structures like the radio station, fire department, dentist's office, telephone company, and the Water Buffalo Lodge, where Fred spent his evenings arguing with Barney. Interiors were decorated in the show's style, with sculpted and animated characters posed throughout. At the far end of Main Street stood Mount Rockmore, a replica of nearby Mount Rushmore, with the carved heads of Fred, Barney, Dino, and Mr. Granite built, a joke that probably landed better in context than it sounds in description. The campground attached to the park added a practical dimension that pure amusement parks couldn't offer. Families driving through the Black Hills on road trips could stay overnight, which kept the operation generating revenue even after the park itself closed for the evening. The Speckles family lived on site and built the park largely themselves, with about a dozen hired hands, completing construction in under a year. 4 generations of the family would eventually call the property home. According to D. Speckles, who spoke about the park years later, the construction was a genuine family undertaking, with relatives working alongside the hired crew to bring the prehistoric town to life in fiberglass and concrete. That hands-on character defined the park's personality in ways that larger, corporate-owned attractions never quite replicated. There was a scrappiness and specificity to the physical details that reflected people who had genuinely cared about what they were building. For a family road trip through the American West in the late 1960s, the logic of stopping at Bedrock City was entirely sound. You were already passing through the Black Hills on the way to Mount Rushmore. The kids knew who Fred Flintstone was. The Bronto Burger Diner was right there. The whole experience cost a modest admission fee and took 2 or 3 hours. That formula, recognizable brand, scenic location, reasonable price, family-friendly, was exactly what the roadside attraction market rewarded, and for its first decade, Bedrock City, South Dakota had it in abundance. Bedrock City, Arizona. The South Dakota location did well enough in its first several years that expansion seemed logical. In 1971, Woody Speckles started looking for a second site. He found it in Valle, Arizona, at the junction of Arizona State Route 64 and U.S. Route 180, roughly halfway between the south rim of the Grand Canyon and the Route 66 town of Williams. The location was essentially a crossroads where a significant number of tourist vehicles passed daily on their way to and from one of the most visited natural landmarks in the country. A Flintstones theme park sitting directly in that traffic stream was, from a purely commercial standpoint, a sensible place to put one. Bedrock City, Arizona, opened in June 1972. It was about half the size of the South Dakota original, closer to 30 acres rather than 62, but it captured the same essential character. Bright, rainbow-colored stone-style buildings reproduced the Bedrock aesthetic. A towering Brontosaurus slide served as the park's centerpiece and most obvious landmark from the road. Inside, visitors could walk through character homes decorated with leopard skin tapestries, archaic furniture, and the specific domestic clutter of a cartoon Stone Age household. Audio from Flintstones episodes played on loop in the background from speakers positioned throughout the park, which created the slightly surreal experience of walking through a physical version of a cartoon while the cartoon itself played around you. The Arizona park was built largely by Woody Speckles and his son Francis, along with other family members. The campground and RV park adjacent to the attraction gave it the same practical overnight dimension that made the South Dakota location work as a destination rather than just a day trip stop. Families heading to or from the Grand Canyon had a recognizable brand to anchor a brief detour, and the park delivered exactly what that audience expected. Photo opportunities with cartoon character statues, a themed diner, and the specific pleasure of standing inside something that previously only existed on television. What the Arizona park offered that the South Dakota one didn't was a geographic accident of almost pure value: the Grand Canyon Visitor Pipeline. Millions of people passed within a few miles of the Valle location every year, and a meaningful fraction of them stopped. For a roadside attraction, that kind of built-in traffic is worth more than almost any marketing budget. Peak years and the roadside attraction era. Both parks operated at their most comfortable during the late 1960s through the mid-1980s, a period that was in many ways the golden age of the American roadside attraction. Before interstate highways fully bypassed smaller routes, before home video gave families a reason to stay in rather than drive through, and before the broader consolidation of the amusement industry around a handful of massive corporate parks, there was an enormous national appetite for the kind of modest, specific, themed experience that Bedrock City offered. The parks weren't trying to compete with Disneyland or Six Flags. They occupied a different category entirely. The roadside stop, the detour, the thing you pulled over for because it looked interesting from the highway and you'd been driving for 4 hours. Families remember visiting Bedrock City the same way they remember stopping at oversized roadside sculptures or drive-through sequoia trees, with the particular fondness attached to experiences that were slightly random, slightly kitschy, and utterly specific to a time and place. During these peak years, the South Dakota Park's various buildings were occupied by characters doing appropriately prehistoric versions of everyday tasks. Costumed character appearances added a live element to what was otherwise a walk-through experience. The campground drew families who built multi-day stays around the park and the broader Black Hills attractions, Mount Rushmore, Custer State Park, the Badlands, creating a kind of Flintstones-anchored vacation itinerary that made sense in the context of that particular region. The Arizona park benefited similarly from its canyon country context, drawing a more transient visitor base of people making the Grand Canyon trip and building Bedrock City into their route as a self-evident stop. "There's a Flintstones park right off the highway" is, for a certain percentage of families traveling with children, a fairly compelling sentence. No further pitch is required. Neither park was particularly expensive to operate compared to a conventional amusement facility. There were no major thrill rides with complex mechanical systems requiring constant maintenance and specialist technicians. The infrastructure was essentially a collection of themed buildings, some statues, a small train, and a food service operation. That simplicity made the business model more resilient than it might otherwise have been as attendance softened. Lower operating costs meant lower break-even points, which kept both parks viable long after more ambitious attractions from the same era had folded. The clouds start forming. The first warning signs appeared through the 1980s as the broader roadside attraction market began to contract. Interstate highway development had already been rerouting traffic away from many older roadside stops for years, and the rise of more sophisticated entertainment options, larger regional amusement parks, home video, the early stages of what would become the theme park industrial complex, meant families making travel decisions were thinking differently than they had in 1966. Attendance at both Bedrock City locations began declining gradually through this period, not catastrophically, but enough to feel it. The physical infrastructure of the parks, built quickly and maintained by a family operation with finite resources, required ongoing investment that became harder to justify as the revenue curve moved in the wrong direction. The Flintstones brand itself remained recognizable and in constant syndication, but awareness of the show skewed increasingly toward nostalgia rather than active viewership, as younger generations grew up with different cartoon franchises competing for their attention. The South Dakota Park's Mount Rockmore and its extensive Main Street buildings continued to draw visitors, but the maintenance demands of concrete and fiberglass structures exposed to South Dakota winters were significant, and the general atmosphere of the park began to show the wear of 2 decades of operation without major renovation. The Arizona location, with its milder desert climate and steadier visitor pipeline from the canyon, held up somewhat better physically, but it wasn't immune to the same broader trends. By the early 1990s, both parks had been operating for roughly 20 years and were showing it. The heyday of the roadside attraction era had genuinely passed. The question was no longer how to grow, but how to continue at all, and the answer was essentially to keep the gates open, maintain what was there, and wait for the visitors who still came. And they still came, not in the numbers of the early years, but enough to keep the operation running season after season. Loyalty from regional families who returned regularly and new visitors discovering the parks for the first time combined to sustain both locations through the early 1990s, even as the structural challenges piled up on the horizon. Warner Brothers enters the picture. The corporate event that ultimately determined the fate of both parks happened several states away and had nothing directly to do with either Speckle's location. In 1992, Ted Turner's Turner Broadcasting System acquired Hanna-Barbera, bringing the Flintstones and the rest of the HB cartoon library under Turner's corporate umbrella. 3 years later, in 1995, Time Warner and Turner Broadcasting announced a $7.5 billion merger, which moved Hanna-Barbera's catalog, including the Flintstones, to Warner Brothers. That transfer of ownership changed the licensing relationship between the Speckles family and the studio in ways that turned out to be significant. Warner Brothers had a specific, updated style guide for the Flintstones characters, reflecting how the studio wanted Fred, Wilma, and the rest to be depicted in licensed products. The physical versions of these characters at the Bedrock City parks, built to match the original 1960s animation style of the show as it had aired on ABC, didn't align with Warner's more current design standards. Warner Brothers approached the South Dakota park and requested that its character depictions be updated to match the studio's official style guidelines. This was a reasonable request from a corporate intellectual property standpoint and a fairly significant expense from the Speckles family standpoint. The tension between those two positions didn't resolve easily, and it set off a years-long conflict over licensing terms and compliance requirements that would eventually end the South Dakota park entirely. The broader context here is worth noting. Warner Brothers had also released a live-action Flintstones feature film in 1994, starring John Goodman as Fred and Rick Moranis as Barney, which was a significant box office success, even if critics were less enthusiastic about it. A sequel, The Flintstones in Viva Rock Vegas, followed in 2000. The studio was actively managing the Flintstones brand as a living commercial franchise rather than a vintage cartoon property, and from that perspective, small regional parks operating with outdated character designs weren't a minor issue. They were a visible departure from the brand standards the studio was trying to maintain globally. That commercial pressure sat behind the licensing dispute, even when the specific conversation between Warner and the Speckles family was technically about character design style guides. By the fall of 2015, after years of back and forth, Warner Brothers declined to renew the Flintstones license for the South Dakota location, citing the park's failure to meet the studio's requirements. Without the license, Bedrock City, South Dakota had no legal basis to operate as a Flintstones attraction. The park closed in 2015. Everything that had made it recognizable, the character statues, the Mount Rockmore carvings, the themed buildings, was removed and demolished. The campground was eventually reopened as Buffalo Ridge Campground Resort, a perfectly functional camping facility with no trace of the prehistoric town that had stood there for nearly 5 decades. By July 2019, the last Flintstones items had been taken down. Arizona hangs on, then let's go. The Arizona location had a different owner by this point. Linda Speckles had taken over management and was running the Valet Park, and in 2015 she announced plans to sell the property, asking $2 million. Woody Speckles, who had built both parks, was no longer alive to see either of their endings, and the next generation of the family was, reasonably, thinking about retirement rather than renovation. The parks had been running for more than 4 decades. The buildings had aged. The licensing situation in South Dakota had demonstrated just how much exposure a family-run operation carried when its entire identity depended on a studio's willingness to keep renewing a contract. The Arizona park closed on January 28, 2019. It briefly reopened for a final summer season, one last run for anyone who wanted to make the trip before it was over, before closing again permanently. The property was then sold to Troy Morris and Ron Brown, who had a different vision for the land, not demolition, but integration. They opened a bird sanctuary and raptor rehabilitation facility called Raptor Ranch on the grounds, preserving the existing Bedrock City structures rather than tearing them down. The cartoon buildings became part of a nature-focused experience, with the Brontosaurus slide still standing, Fred's house still painted in its cartoon colors, and the general physical fabric of the park intact, just repurposed for an operation that had nothing to do with Hanna-Barbera. For visitors who make the detour to Valet today, Bedrock City exists as a kind of living artifact, the physical remains of a 1970s roadside attraction that has simply been folded into a new context without being erased. That's an unusual outcome in a category where most closed attractions get demolished and paved over. The preservation is informal and accidental, rather than the product of any deliberate historic effort, but it means the structures survived where the South Dakota equivalents didn't. What Bedrock City actually was. Stepping back from the ownership transitions and licensing disputes, it's worth acknowledging what both parks were doing in their best years, creating a physical version of a shared fictional world in a way that families genuinely found worthwhile. The parks weren't technically sophisticated, weren't trying to be. They were hand-built concrete approximations of animated backgrounds, staffed and maintained by a family that lived on the property, licensed from a studio that originally charged reasonable rates to use characters it had created. That's a different category from the theme park industry in the conventional sense. Bedrock City sat closer to folk art or living diorama than to engineered entertainment. The appeal was specifically the gap between expectation and reality. You knew you were looking at painted fiberglass and not actual prehistoric architecture, and the charm was in the specificity of the attempt anyway. Someone had built the Water Buffalo Lodge. Someone had carved Mount Rockmore. Someone had installed speakers to pipe Flintstones audio through an empty landscape near the Grand Canyon so that Fred's voice bounced off the painted rocks of a cartoon town in the Arizona desert. The people who visited these parks as children and still remember them decades later tend to describe the experience in terms that have nothing to do with technical quality. They remember the specific weirdness of walking through a cartoon, the Bronto Burger Diner, the Brontosaurus slide, the incongruity of prehistoric architecture against a backdrop of actual Black Hills pine trees or actual Arizona desert. One former visitor, reflecting on a childhood trip to the South Dakota park, described it as the kind of place that seemed almost too specific to be real, too committed to the bit, which was exactly the quality that made it memorable long after more polished, better-funded attractions had faded from recollection. That specificity of memory is the measure of whether something worked, and by that measure, Bedrock City worked for a very long time. The broader lesson. Both parks closed not because the Flintstones stopped being remembered, but because corporate intellectual property management runs on different logic than a family-operated roadside attraction. The Speckles family had a license, and licenses have terms, and terms are renegotiated by studios whose priorities are brand consistency and revenue rather than the preservation of a 50-year-old concrete recreation of a cartoon town in Custer, South Dakota. The South Dakota park story in particular is a clean illustration of what happens when a modest, specific, family-run attraction built around licensed intellectual property runs up against the eventual expectations of a major entertainment corporation. Warner Brothers wanted updated character depictions. The park couldn't or wouldn't comply to the required standard. The license wasn't renewed. The buildings came down. A campground opened where Bedrock used to be. There's a version of this story where the outcome is different, where the Speckles family had the resources or willingness to update the character designs, or where Warner Brothers took a more accommodating approach to a decades-old regional attraction operating in good faith with a license it had held since before the studio even owned the property. That version didn't happen. The studio's priorities won, and the park paid the price for being built on ground it didn't legally own in the most important sense. Not the land, but the characters. The Flintstones themselves continue. Warner Brothers has maintained and extended the franchise through various spin-offs, reboots, and licensing deals over the years. An animated series reboot has been in various stages of development. The characters remain active commercial properties, appearing in new contexts regularly enough to suggest the brand still has commercial utility, even 6 decades after Fred first shouted "Yabba Dabba Doo" on ABC. The Arizona park got the better ending mostly by accident. New owners who saw value in preserving rather than clearing the site. The physical remains of Bedrock City sit in Valle today alongside Birds of Prey, which is an outcome nobody involved in the park's original construction in 1972 would have predicted, but also one that's hard to be too unhappy about. At least the Brontosaurus slide is still there. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.